Hey guys, welcome to the third and final installment of this three-part series where we look at the Traitor Primarchs and try to figure out just how sad we should be for each of them. So far, on my totally radical homemade graph, we have Magnus and Angron in our Saddest category, Conrad and Fulgrim in our second Saddest, and Lorgar and Perturabo having the times of their lives in our not sad at all category. We don't have anyone yet in our third category, the one where we'd stick a Primarch who's kind of having a good time doing chaos stuff, but not always. But don't worry, because I've got some guys who can fill that spot up today. Let's start it off with a Primarch who I've done dirty on this channel multiple times. A Primarch who, admittedly, deserves a lot of sympathy for how dirty he was done by the universe. Mr. Stinky Supreme himself, Mortarion. As always, let's start at the beginning. Mortarion's gestation pod landed on the planet of Barbarus, a world effectively split in two. In the low-slung valleys of the world, humans lived in primitive villages. They had no advanced technology and were barely able to survive through farming and hunting. In the mountains that rose high above the valleys lived the cruel necromantic overlords who ruled Barbarus. They regularly terrorized the villagers, using armies of reanimated humans to attack their villages and steal more people to add to their hordes of undead. These necromancers also regularly fought each other, and Mortarion's gestation pod landed amongst the corpses of one of these battles. The most powerful overlord on Barbarus, Naker, found baby Mortarion screaming and crying. This was unusual, because the mountains of Barbarus were covered in a thick, toxic fog that only the necromancers could survive in. Any regular human would have suffocated almost immediately, so Naker knew that Mortarion was something special. He took Mortarion higher into the mountains and kept him imprisoned in a tower that was placed at the absolute limit of Mortarion's superhuman abilities to survive in the toxic fog. Over the next number of years, he trained Mortarion, shaping him into a warrior that he would one day use to take over control of Barbarus entirely. But Mortarion eventually started to question his reality. From his perspective, he'd only ever known his immediate surroundings. He was taken by Naker from the toxic battlefield where he crash-landed to the even more toxic mountains, and that was all he'd ever seen. So, he began to wonder why Naker would venture out of the mountains and down into the valleys below, but would never allow him to do the same. And so one day, he escaped. Mortarion killed the guards stationed at the tower that had been his home and set out for the valleys of Barbarus. What he found there shocked him. In the valleys, Mortarion found humans, people who were the same as him. Well, not exactly, but you know what I mean. He had more in common with them than he did with the necromantic, toxin-breathing zombie army commander who had raised him. Realizing that these people had been not only oppressed, but also terrorized by the overlords of Barbarus for as long as they could remember, Mortarion swore that he would do everything he could to save them. He began to train the villagers, and as word spread throughout the valleys of his arrival, people from other villages began to seek out his help as well. Mortarion began to journey from settlement to settlement, training his fellow humans, and also enlisting the help of crafts and tradespeople from the settlements to create armor and weapons that could withstand the fog of the mountains, allowing Mortarion to create an army of his own to take the fight to the necromancers on their own turf. And eventually, only one remained to be defeated. Mortarion's adoptive father/imprisoner/horrifying magic zombie maker, Naker. However, it was at this point that Morty's village was visited by a strange stranger. Angered by the presence of this outsider, Mortarion informed him that he and his people needed no help, especially from a weird guy who had just appeared out of nowhere. And this is where that weird guy, who, spoiler alert, was the Emperor of Mankind, committed one of the most colossal fuck-ups of all time. In this series, we've gotten to look at the various ways the Emperor chose to introduce himself to his sons. With Magnus, he actually didn't need to introduce himself once they met in person, because he and Magnus had been having a grand old time flying through the warp together. He and Fulgrim had a lovely first meeting, with Fulgrim agreeing to join him immediately. Even with Conrad Kurz, who had one of the most fucked up lives a Primarch could possibly have, the Emperor used his psychic might to relieve Kurz's mind-shattering visions of death and destruction so that their first meeting could be one of at least some comfort. Then there was Angron, and that was pretty bad. And then there was Mortarion. When Big E and Morty spoke for the first time, Big E could have explained everything to him. He could have said, "Hey man, Mortarion, is it? Wow, cool name. High Gothic for Child of Death. Very cool. Love it. You know how you're a literal demigod who is currently fighting for control over this entire planet? Well, I'm your dad. I'm the most powerful being in the universe, and I made you to be a general in my army. I have an entire legion of warriors waiting for you to take control of, and they are created in your image as you are in mine. I know that you've spent all this time preparing to fight this really powerful necromancer, and I'd be happy to let you do it, but I'm afraid he might kill you. If you're unable to take him out yourself, I'd like to kindly, humbly offer to assist you. Even better, maybe we could fight him together, and with our combined might, we can take him out, and you can even deliver the killing blow. Together, we can finally free your planet of these oppressors, and they can be welcomed into the Imperium of Man and be reunited with the rest of humanity. That's what could have happened. What did the Emperor do instead? He basically said, "Oh, hey, you smelly weird fuck, here's a challenge for you. You can go and fight that guy, and if you win, I'll leave. If you lose, you'll swear your life to serving me forever, in eternal pledge, you moron." I paraphrased a little, but that's more or less what happened. And so Mortarion was like, all right, well, first off, fuck you. I'm never gonna like you, asshole. And second, watch me. I'll kill Necair myself. There's no way this will go wrong. And then it went wrong. Mortarion pursued Necair to his stronghold alone, feeling an urge to prove himself to the man who was secretly the Emperor. The confrontation with Necair was brief. Even Mortarion couldn't survive at the altitude that Necair could, and the toxicity of the fog was so strong that it began to decompose his armor and poison Mortarion. As he began to lose consciousness, with Necair walking towards him, laughing at him for his failure, he heard a voice in his head that belonged to someone else, or something else. It spoke to him of how to truly defeat death. But before it could reveal more to him, the stranger from the valley appeared, stepping between Morty and Necair and slaying the necromantic ruler with a single strike. Upon recovering, Mortarion reluctantly swore his allegiance to the stranger, who only then revealed himself as the Emperor, as Mortarion's true father, and so on and so forth. Obviously, Mortarion never truly got over this first encounter. I've gotten some comments on past videos where I talk about Mortarion saying that I'm too harsh on him or that I don't truly understand his character, which I think is actually very fair. Part of why I'm doing this series is to better understand the human sides of the Traitor Primarchs, and as such, I've decided that I'll actually give Mortarion a bit of a break in this video. I'm not going to rip into him as much as I want to for his inhuman levels of pettiness, but I will recommend checking out Mr. Bones' video on Mortarion because, oh my god, does he say everything I want to about Mortarion in just such a poetic way. Mortarion would lead the Death Guard Legion throughout the Great Crusade, constantly being eaten alive on the inside by the extreme dislike he had for the Emperor, although he didn't show it externally. When Horus turned against the Emperor, Mortarion needed no convincing to join him. His tortured upbringings at the hands of a warp-channeling necromancer led to him having an everlasting hatred for all warp users, and Horus used this hatred to his advantage. He pointed out that the Emperor was a sorcerer who channeled the warp for power, and Mortarion was like, "What? You're telling me our 14-foot-tall immortal dad who stands before us shining brighter than the sun and speaks to us by injecting his thoughts directly into our brains isn't just a scientist? He's using magic?" Again, paraphrasing here, but needless to say, Mortarion was sold. And remember that voice I talked about? The voice that promised to show Mortarion how to defeat death? That voice was Nurgle, the chaos god of disease, decay, death, and destruction. Now, personally, I think that if Necair had slain Mortarion in that moment, that Nurgle would have reanimated him and taken him as his champion. But since the Emperor intervened, Nurgle would have to wait a little while longer before claiming Mortarion as his own. As the Heresy reached its climax with the traitor forces preparing to engage in the Siege of Terra, Mortarion ordered his fleet to journey to the Sol System. But his first captain, Callus Typhon, had secretly been granted a higher level of understanding of the true powers at play behind the scenes of the Heresy. He no longer swore allegiance to Mortarion, but instead to Nurgle, and was ready to unleash a plan that would bring the rest of the Death Guard into Nurgle's warm, disgusting embrace. Typhon had every navigator in the fleet killed, and then reassured Mortarion that he could act as their navigator, delivering the fleet to the Sol System. It was insane to trust Typhon, but Mortarion really didn't have a choice. Without their navigators, they would be lost in space, potentially forever, and although Mortarion was disgusted at the idea that one of his own Astartes would be engaging in sorcery to help them reach Terra, it was really the only hope they had. Once the Death Guard fleet had entered the warp, their fate was sealed. Typhon had delivered them directly into Nurgle's hands, and Nurgle quickly set about ensuring that they would fall and serve him for eternity. He unleashed the soul-corrupting disease known as Nurgle's rot on the warriors of the Legion as well as on their ships. The ships became filled with the tortured, guttural screams of disgust and despair as the resilient warriors of the Death Guard became trapped in a state of undying decay. Their bodies became bloated and began to rot before their very eyes, their armor becoming infused with their skin. I don't know how graphic I can get describing what happened to the Death Guard without getting demonetized, or if that's even a thing, but I'm going to play it safe today and just say that if you want to be really grossed out, there's plenty of reading you can do that really drives home just how gross Nurgle's rot was. To put it simply, like I said before, it is a disease that corrupts the soul. Not only does it feel like the worst food poisoning, cold, flu, and every other sickness you could have times a million, it literally corrupts your soul. And since Typhon had left the Death Guard stranded in the warp where time doesn't exist, all the Death Guard afflicted by Nurgle's rot felt as though they were suffering for eternity. They could have been afflicted for 10 minutes or 100 years. There was no real way for them to tell. And nobody was hit worse than Mortarion. He tried to refuse to give in to the rot. He tried to fight with every ounce of strength he had. After what seemed to be, and very well might have been, an eternity, Mortarion, unable to allow his sons to suffer any longer, gave in. He pledged his soul to Nurgle, and in an instant, the screams and the pain stopped. The warriors weren't cured, though. They had simply had the pain taken away. They were still infected, bloated, disgusting, and gross, but their feelings of despair and agony were now replaced with those of warmth and happiness. Mortarion, though, much like Angron, had only traded one master for another, and then another. And as we said, Morty had an undying hatred for sorcery and psychers, which is inconvenient for him, because after becoming a demon Primarch, he was literally made of sorcery. So that, in a nutshell, is the story of Mortarion. Yes, he bitched constantly throughout the Great Crusade about anything and everything. Yes, he was the most annoyingly petty, grumpy, shit-ass dude in the entire Imperium. And yes, even before becoming a demon Primarch of the smelliest, most disgusting god of the warp, Mortarion already smelled like shit. But guys, he really didn't have much of a choice, at least in my eyes. His life played out in a way that saw him being screwed over at pretty much every major opportunity, and when he finally fell to chaos, he only did it to save his sons. Even now, he doesn't really like Nurgle that much, and he absolutely despises Typhon. And even with nearly unlimited power, he's still petty and angry at everybody. And honestly, at this stage, I just respect it. So, where does good old Morty land on our handy chart of sadness? Well, after much thought, I decided to put him here. This one might be controversial, so if you disagree with my placement, let me know why, but I will explain myself. Mortarion had a very shitty life, being raised by an evil, terrifying psychic warlord. He was then forcefully recruited into serving a genocidal psychic warlord. And what was his reward for finally trying to free himself and his legion from the service of that genocidal psychic warlord? Being turned into a terrifying, consistently rotting, evil, genocidal psychic warlord. Mortarion was doomed to become the very thing he hated more than anything else, and that makes me cry every time. Now, let's move on to a guy who I honestly feel like I could sum up in about 5 minutes. We'll see how that goes. I've been pretty good at writing way too much and making these videos way longer than I thought they'd be recently, so we'll see what happens. But up next, we're going to talk about the man himself, the one and only ultimate supreme dumbass of the galaxy, Horus Luprical. Horus crash-landed and grew up on the planet of Chthoniya before being reunited extremely early on with the Emperor. He was the first Primarch to be found and spent many years at the Emperor's side before any of his fellow brothers were discovered. Horus's greatest ability as a warrior was one that he learned during his time alongside the Emperor on Crusade. Simply put, Horus was the greatest leader that ever led. No matter who you were, no matter what part of the Imperium you hailed from, to serve alongside the great Horus Luprical was only one step below serving alongside the Emperor himself. Unlike a lot of the Primarchs, we know relatively little about Horus's early life, or even much of his life leading up to the Great Crusade, so we'll just skip right past all that. But something I've talked about before, and I feel the need to reiterate again, is just how does balding work in 40k? Remember, the Primarchs grew to adulthood extremely rapidly, and then basically stayed in young adult form for a super long time. As far as I know, they grew to their adult form in around 5 years, or even less. So, Did Horus start losing his hair when he was like 3? Did he have hair until he was 5 and then it just disappeared? No matter the case, Horus and his shiny hairless dome inspired confidence in warriors, both Astartes and human, throughout the Imperium. But all good things must come to an end. And after Lorgar of the Wordbearers decided that it was time for the galaxy to understand the truth that lay covered behind the curtains of reality, his first chaplain Erebus got to work. And oh boy, did Erebus get to work. Through a series of extremely well-planned and executed events, the Wordbearer slowly wormed his way into Horus's inner circle, and while Horus and the Luna Wolves were engaged in political discussions with the Interrex, an advanced human civilization, Erebus set his plan in motion. From an Interrex museum, Erebus stole the Kinnabrak Anathema, a chaos artifact, a sword blessed by Nurgle. A wielder of the sword needed only to speak the name of their desired target, and the sword, upon striking that target, would curse them with a disease made to afflict them exactly. Erebus gave the sword to Eugen Temba, the former planetary governor of the imperial world of Davin, who became corrupted by Nurgle, and after the Luna Wolves had been drawn to the trap set in the Davin system and Horus had personally come face to face with Temba, he was mortally wounded when Temba, imbued with superhuman power from Nurgle, managed to strike him with the blade. Side note here, Temba gets cut off from the warp before he dies, meaning that all he feels is the pain and horror of being corrupted by Nurgle, you know, the reality of it, and he immediately voices his extreme disgust and regret at himself for falling to chaos. And Horus hears him say all that, and he just completely disregards it down the line. Not the first dumbass move Horus made, and definitely not the last. The apothecaries of the Luna Wolves proved unable to heal Horus, and with the fear of losing the greatest Primarch looming over the Legion, Erebus was able to convince them to let him take Horus to the Temple of the Serpent Lodge, where he promised Horus could be made well again. Despite pretty much everyone in the Luna Wolves distrusting Erebus and thinking he was a slimy, shifty asshole, which he was, they relented. Known only to Erebus, though, the cultists of the Serpent Lodge were worshippers of chaos undivided. Erebus entered the lodge, taking Horus's body with him, and the doors were sealed behind them. While in the temple, a bunch of chaos ritual stuff happened, and Horus and Erebus were able to commune via their souls. Erebus literally tried to gaslight and lie to Horus the entire time, and for some reason, Horus saw through the gaslighting and the lies, and then just decided to go along with everything Erebus was saying. Long story short, Horus was presented with the opportunity to betray the Emperor, to start a galactic civil war that would see the Imperium fall and result in his supreme reign of the galaxy, all in exchange for swearing his allegiance to the powers of chaos. Keep in mind that one of the main reasons Horus eventually became upset at the Emperor was that he felt the pressure of leading the Great Crusade alone was too much to bear. So he decided to launch a way greater counter-crusade that would see him killing his own brothers and probably killing half the humans in the galaxy. Idiot. Sorry. I get salty when I talk about Horus because well, oh my god, this guy is an idiot. But to be fair, Games Workshop didn't have any backstory for him for like 30 years, so they had to do their best, and they did pretty good in my opinion. But still, Horus, you are an idiot. Anyways, Horus was saved when he agreed to Erebus's plan, and they emerged from the Temple of the Serpent Lodge many days after they had first entered. At this point, Horus began to set in motion the events that would lead to the Heresy. And as we have been doing in this series so far, we'll now skip over the entire heresy itself and jump to the end. Horus and his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, both now supercharged with the power of Chaos Undivided, were in geostationary orbit above Terra as Terra itself was put under siege by the Traitor forces. The Imperial Palace was under attack, and most of Terra was being laid to waste by Traitor Marines, Dark Mechanicum forces, and literal demons. You know, I can't help but think that when your army has literal demons in it, that you may stop for a second and think, wait a minute, am I the baddie? But that moment for Horus would come pretty quickly. We'll get to it in like a minute or two. The Emperor knew that the only way to defeat Horus was to face him directly, and so he, Sanguinius, Rogel Dorn, and a bunch of other badass Imperial forces teleported from the Imperial Palace to the Vengeful Spirit. They were split apart as they arrived though, and remember, these ships are absolutely huge. Sanguinius, having foreseen his destiny countless times, knew that he would be the first to find Horus, and that he would find him alone. And find him he did. As they paced around one another on the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, Horus, resplendent and more powerful than ever in his brand new Terminator armor and chaos power, asked Sanguinius, already broken down and beaten from weeks of non-stop fighting, one more time to join him, to betray humanity and their father. Sanguinius, knowing what lay in store for him, refused. Sanguinius, the great angel, my goat, and the only 40k character that my little sister likes, was slain by the War Master, but not before puncturing his armor with one tiny near microscopic slit. This is one of those 40k things that's like, oh, some scholars of Imperial history believe Sanguinius may have pierced his armor, but we'll never truly know type of bullshit things GW loves to do. But I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. Sanguinius did that shit. All right? My goat poked a hole in Horus's armor. I refuse to accept any information to the contrary. It was after Sanguinius's tragic death that the Emperor reached the bridge and pleaded once more with Horus to abandon all the crazy shit he was doing. And believe it or not, Horus refused. I like to imagine that being imbued with the power of chaos while also already being a 10-foot tall superhuman demigod has to feel pretty good. Like, I don't think there are any drugs on the planet that could get you close to feeling even a fraction as good as Horus was feeling. So, obviously, he refused the Emperor's plea, and then they had a sick battle, as you can see here. Like, holy shit, that's pretty cool. Anyways, the Emperor was finally able to bring himself to strike down his most beloved son and hit him with a blast of psychic energy that pierced the hole in Horus's armor made by Sanguinius that was so pure that it cut Horus off from the warp completely and immediately brought him back to just regular old Horus. In that moment, Horus truly finally realized what he had done. He saw the past 10 years of carnage he had wrought across the galaxy and realized that not only was it committed against his own people, but that he had failed to bring his plans to fruition to finally justify all that destruction. He expressed nothing but regret and asked his father for forgiveness. The Emperor, knowing that Horus's soul now belonged for eternity to the ruinous powers, did the only thing he could. He obliterated Horus's soul entirely, erasing it from existence in the warp so that it could never be used by the ruinous powers again. There are a lot of people who say that this is wrong, despite it being written in numerous codices, and they'll say that the Emperor actually forgave Horus at the last moment. But no, why would the Emperor let there be any chance that Horus could return? Just no. And so, where do we put Horus Luprical? Well, this one's weird because he's dead, but I think it's pretty safe to say that while he was alive, he was undoubtedly #warp blessed. Then, once he wasn't warp blessed, he was like, oh fuck, oh man, I should not have killed all those billions and billions of people. Oh, whoops, ah, haha, ooh, shit. And then he died. So, I guess we can put him here. He's definitely a, kind of guy. Even during the Heresy, Lorgar lost faith in Horus being able to bring victory to the traitors and tried to kill him. And ironically, Horus's greatest achievement in the galaxy was to have Abaddon in the Luna Wolves, because Abaddon now leads the Black Legion and is the greatest warrior for chaos in the entire galaxy. And Abaddon thinks Horus was a bitch. So there you go. Okay, last guy. Alpharius. Every time I talk about the Alpha Legion in a video, I get the overwhelming urge to try to talk about them in the same way they existed, which is just confusing the shit out of anyone unfortunate enough to be watching. I will not be doing that today. No. Let's get into the lore of Alpharius and his twin brother, Omegon. For any of you who don't know, Games Workshop created the Alpha Legion to basically just continuously mindfuck us, the readers, and also every character in the 40k universe whenever they felt like it. Legion, The Alpha Legion novel that depicts most of what we'll talk about in this video was so good at confusing me as to what the hell was going on that I'm pretty much convinced that every single Alpha Legionnaire that had a storyline in that book was actually just Alpharius pretending to be different guys. Alpharius has the most mysterious origin of any of the 18 Primarchs. What makes his origin so mysterious? Well, the fact that there are numerous stories that depict how he grew up and was found by the Imperium, and all of them are most likely not true. One depicts Alpharius as the cunning commander of a small fleet of ships that managed to outmaneuver the Luna Wolves, with Alpharius himself assassinating his way through the vengeful spirit to the bridge of the ship, coming face to face with Horus himself, who only then realized that he was looking at the last of his lost brothers. Another story has Alpharius being cast down in his gestation pod on a dead world, being forced to survive as the sole living being on the hostile, desolate planet. And when a ship of ne'er-do-wells arrived on the planet, looking to plunder whatever riches remained on its surface, Alpharius slaughtered them all single-handedly, and with their weapons and supplies now in hand, left the world aboard their commandeered ship. And there are also stories that depict him as being the first Primarch to be found, even before Horus, and those stories say he was raised in complete and utter secrecy by the Emperor on Terra before being cast out to accomplish some list of secret tasks. And all of these stories, like I said, are wrong. Or at least none of them is entirely correct. Why is that? Well, because they all talk of Alpharius, but they don't mention Omegon. You see, Alpharius is not one man. Well, Alpharius is, but Omegon is also Alpharius, even though he's Omegon. You get what I mean? It's said that Alpharius and Omegon were two men who shared one soul. Not only were they completely identical, but they very often switched places with one another, with Omegon acting as Alpharius and vice versa. Once reunited with their legion, they also often mingled within the ranks of their warriors, while an Astartes of the Alpha Legion would play the role of Alpharius while meeting with an Astra Militarum general or someone equally important. The Alpha Legion, believe it or not, got up to all kinds of fuckery throughout the Great Crusade. They repeatedly engaged in their battles against hostile worlds in a creative manner as opposed to an efficient manner. The Alpha Legion's approach to warfare more or less consisted of confusing the hell out of their opponents until they found they were surrounded without ammo, supplies, or enough people to continue fighting. At this point, they would surrender and the Alpha Legion would be victorious. But come on, you idiots. That's not how we do it in the Imperium. You're going to use tactics and strategy and the power of thinking to defeat the enemy when we could just super nuke them from orbit and then charge directly into their last remaining defenses, taking heavy losses and killing civilians in the process? Idiots is what you are. That's a real quote from Robute Gilliman. Just kidding. But my point stands. The more that Alpharius was censured by the other Primarchs for his creative and artsy approach to warfare, the more he employed it. Yeah, it's good to see that rage baiting is still alive and well in the 31,000s. Of course, since this is the Alpha Legion, literally every single recorded thing about them is probably a lie, or is definitely true but disguised as a lie, if that even makes sense. So we can more or less gloss over a lot of what Alpharius and Omegon got up to leading up to the beginning of the Heresy. Something that 100% did happen, though, was the meeting that took place between the Alpha Legion and the Cabal, a highly secretive organization composed of intelligent alien races from across the galaxy who were able to peer into the future and interpret the outcomes of various timelines. After much deliberation over which Imperial Legion to bless with their information about the future, the Cabal chose the Alpha Legion. Long story short, and it is a long story, Alpharius and Omegon met with representatives from the Cabal on the planet of Eolith, where the representatives tasked them with joining Horus and aligning themselves with the forces of chaos so that a greater future could eventually be imparted upon the galaxy. And what was that great future, you may ask? Well, the Cabal foresaw Horus's civil war ultimately leading to the complete and utter destruction of humanity, which would starve the Chaos Gods of their sources of power and destroy them. Alpharius and Omegon ultimately agreed to embark on this quest, and did what they could to aid Horus in achieving victory over the Imperium, except that didn't happen. As we discussed, Horus died. And as we didn't discuss, the Emperor also kind of died, and now humanity is more widespread and violent and crazy than ever, meaning that instead of the Chaos Gods being wiped out by the 41st millennium, they are instead more powerful than ever before and are poised to eventually destroy reality. So that's cool. But hey, at least Alpharius and Omegon tried. Or did they? We will never truly know, probably. So, where are they now? Well, Alpharius is dead. He was slain by Rogel Dorn, sadly, in an extremely epic battle, and in a very Alpharius and Rogel Dorn kind of way. Throughout the whole fight, Alpharius tries to reason with Dorn to explain to him that they actually, ultimately, are fighting for more or less the same thing. The only problem is he's Alpharius, so everything he tells Rogel just sounds confusing and weird and contradictory. And then Rogel is Rogel, so he just ignores Alpharius anyways, says absolutely nothing, then ultimately cuts off his hands, gouges his chest open, and boops him on the top of the head with his Primarch-sized chainsword, Storm's Teeth. Then he looks at Alpharius, who's pretty clearly pretty dead, still says nothing, and leaves. Now, I know with the Alpha Legion that we love to bring out those, well, actually, what if it wasn't Alpharius and it was one of his Astartes type of lines? But this definitely was Alpharius for two reasons. One, at one point, Alpharius actually gets the upper hand in the battle and is poised to likely defeat Dorn. There is not a single Astartes in the galaxy who could even hope to best Dorn in combat, so it had to be Alpharius or Omegon. But it was Alpharius. And we know that because of this important second reason, which is that multiple Black Library authors have confirmed that it was Alpharius and that he is dead. That's right. They did such a great job of mind-fucking all of us with their writing about the Alpha Legion that they straight up needed to get multiple authors to break the fourth wall and go, guys, for real, he's actually dead. Please stop with the fan theories. He's dead. 100%. Which is exactly what a bunch of authors who are secretly going to bring Alpharius back to life would say. But I digress. Omegon is probably still alive, maybe, I think. But the Alpha Legion of the 41st millennium isn't really reminiscent of the 30k era Alpha Legion anyways, so who knows? If he is alive, he's spent the last 12,000 years doing a whole lot of nothing. Or has he? That one is actually a genuine question because I don't know. So, after all that, where are we going to throw Alpharius and Omegon, aka Alpharius Omegon, aka Alpharius, in our handy-dandy graph? I ended up settling here, because when you think of the Alpha Legion in 30k, and you see that they turn to Chaos as a sort of business move to keep the old galaxy from completely destroying itself, you think to yourself, I mean, yeah, good move. And when you read about the Alpha Legion in 40k, constantly bickering with each other and going around the galaxy trolling and rage-baiting the Imperium, you go, I mean, yeah, I guess that's a choice you can make. So, yeah. Still, without a doubt, my favorite Chaos Legion, though. And do you know who I love even more than the Alpha Legion? My breathtaking channel members. Today, we have a new member to welcome to the channel. Dan White, thank you so much for joining. If you guys were villagers fighting horrifying necromancers on a toxic world of plagues and death, I would teleport down to the surface and be really nice to the super mutant freakazoid who was fighting on your behalf, so that we could all live happily ever after. If you were an advanced human civilization who had reservations about joining the genocidal authoritarian galactic dictatorship ran by my dad, I would hold very courteous political discussions with you and make sure that none of the dipshits in my retinue broke into any of your museums to steal any of your super dangerous, fate of the galaxy changing weapons. And if you were civilians on a world that refused to join the Imperium, I would do my very best to not have my legion of warriors who look just like me confuse the complete and utter shit out of you for fun. Or maybe I would. You never know, because I am Alpharius. If you want to become a channel member, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, see ya.